You're listening to Discutafel podcast, your green audio about gardening, the outdoors and sustainability. Hello, these are my chickens in my summer garden in the Netherlands, and this is Ivonne speaking to you in episode 143 of Discutafel podcast. This episode has been released on August 7th, 2023. What's there to enjoy this time? This episode of your Discutafel podcast is one part of a rather extensive series around gardens in Canada. I visited these places in August 22. You can listen to each single episode separately, one of them or all of them, in the sequence of your own choice, of course. In case you need an explanation on a name mentioned or so, please go to other episodes in the series or contact us at Discutafel. Well, what's up in this episode? The Butchart Gardens is a display garden and it's located in Brentwood Bay on Vancouver Island, Canada. That's where I am now, at the very spot. It has been created by Jennie Butchart in 1904, and it's about 22 hectares, and it's about a quarter of a square kilometers, when you want to know exactly. This place used to be a limestone quarry and a cement plant. Now it's a sunken garden, thanks to a balloon flying lady called Jennie Butchart from Toronto. As I think gardens reflect their creator, I'll certainly tell you a little bit more about Jennie later on in this podcast. Today, the Butchart Gardens is a National Historic Site of Canada. Jennie Butchart passed away in 1950, but these gardens are still privately owned and operated by the family. We'll find remnants of the original cement plant and millions of bedding plants in over 900 varieties are awaiting us. So let's go. Discu coverage. So let's go and descend now into the pit. The former quarry. Steps are leading towards the bottom of the sunken garden. As you might hear, we're not alone here. It seems that almost 1 million visitors a year are welcomed here in Butchart Gardens. And as we lower down, we get a better view on the flower beds. Orange, purple, red colors all around. Very neatly managed. Above our heads, the aeroplanes. I tried to avoid them when recording this coverage, but it seems to be impossible. But as I look up, I also see some birds of prey circling in the air above the quarry. So here we are at the bottom of the quarry. Between the flower beds, neatly mowed lawn, and I also see a lizard there in the sunshine, bathing in the sunshine. Two of them, two green ones. Hello there. Are you living here? That's a nice place to live. So Jennie, she envisioned a grand garden where the cement plant used to be, but there was no topsoil, only a gigantic pit near the house. And I'm standing there now, in this gigantic pit. She began transferring topsoil by horse and cart, just like that. People have been intervening all the time, haven't they? And Miss Butchart was no exception. With a little help from her husband, by the way, because he often supplied workmen from the factory to assist in the ever-growing project of gardening. The rubble on the floor of the pit was pushed into tall mounds of rock on which terraced flowers were planted. Miss Butchart solved the problem of the grim grey quarry walls by dangling over in a bosun's chair. For Dutch listeners, a bosun's chair is a boatsman's stoeltje, like the one sailors used to work safely high above the ship in the mast. She was lowered down by workers over the side of the quarry in this bosun's chair, hanging more than 15 meters up in the air to carefully plant ivy into small spaces in the rock. She was an adventurous lady indeed. Well, nowadays we see this sunken garden with green cloaked walls of the original quarry. It has 151 flower beds and about 65,000 bulbs planted for spring. And where I'm standing here, I see a mound in the center of the quarry. And this mound was of an inferior grade of limestone and therefore not quarried. Left intact, it provided a natural viewpoint amid the developing garden beds. Jennie Butchart planted a pair of arbor vitae, trees of life, on either side of the walkway in 1920. They have become a distinguishing part of the sunken garden and have been replaced 3 times. I'm looking at them now. As we walk on the bottom of the sunken garden, we notice that flower beds usually have 2 kinds of flowers in each bed, 2 kinds of plants, as if to say that the time when there's something flowering in this flower bed is being prolonged. For instance, I see tagetes now and begonia. And they don't flower at the same time. And when it's not about the flowering time, it's about the color of the foliage, which gives a nice contrast. So the story of the Butchart Gardens begins with cement. Because this Miss Butchart and her husband had moved to Vancouver Island to build a cement plant on a rich limestone deposit. In those days, the West Coast was exploding with development. Cement was in constant demand from San Francisco to Seattle. The story goes that the newlywed couple had travelled to England to embark on their honeymoon. And on this romantic trip, I suppose it was a romantic trip, her husband Robert obtained the cement recipe that would make him one of the first in Canada to produce Portland cement. Jennie had Irish ancestors, and her husband, Mr. Robert Butchart, was the son of Scottish parents who had moved to Ontario in Canada. He married Jennie Foster Kennedy, or Jennie Butchart, who created these gardens. But Jennie had more talents. She was a very adventurous lady who enjoyed ballooning and flying, and she later became a qualified chemist as well. But the cement production was already over about a decade later, since they had used almost all of the limestone deposits. And while the cement company had been a financial success, you can imagine it produced an ecological mess here. The cement industry is not very sustainable, as we realize now. And at the time, Jennie looked out of the window and saw an abandoned plant with heaps of rubble and rusted machinery. And she didn't like that. She didn't like the view, and she didn't like the idea of the destruction of this beautiful ecosystem. Well, we're leaving Butchart's Gardens for now, but don't worry. Join me in another episode of Discutafel podcast when I'm exploring more of Butchart's Gardens on Vancouver Island. Discu finish. Getting interested to know more about my adventures in Canada with gardens, I suggest go to our episode list, our podcast episode list, and you'll find it on your playlist on the streaming service you're using or on your podcast app. Depending on the date you hear this show, you will find one or more episodes on Canada. We also publish blogs on the subject on our website Discutafel.nl. We're back in my city garden in the Netherlands. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Discutafel podcast. English episodes, they are irregular here at the frequency of these episodes, but you can expect the next English one very soon. It's part 2 of this holiday special on the Butchart Gardens in Canada. We expect it to be online from August the 9th, 2023. In the meantime, let's go outside. And until next time.